November is getting close, and that means that the election is right around the corner. For quality coverage of all aspects of the election and expert analysis on top stories from around the world, there's no better place than the DSR Network. Members of the DSR Network get exclusive access to members-only segments of our podcasts, an ad-free listening experience, and access to our Slack and Discord communities where you can connect with fellow members and us. For the month of September, use code SNARK for 30% off your subscription at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's code SNARK at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Now please enjoy the show.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. On Tuesday night, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump will face off in their first debate. It goes without saying that the stakes are extremely high, as polls now show the two of them effectively tied, with perhaps a very slight edge to Harris. Yet some analysts out there have made good arguments holding that the pieces really are in place for her to win this thing. Today we're talking about those arguments with Lakshya Jain of the group Split Ticket, who's been really illuminating at analyzing what the data tells us. He's going to help us test the case for optimism and understand what Harris has to accomplish at the debate. Great to have you back on.
Thanks for having me.
Let's quickly talk about the state of the race. Your firm, Split Ticket's polling averages have Harris up 2.7 points nationally, less than 1 point up in Pennsylvania, 1.5 points up in Michigan, 2.5 up in Wisconsin, and Trump is ahead in each of Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina by less than a point. 538's averages are almost the same. And of course, the big story of the moment is still the New York Times poll showing Trump up nationally by 1 point among likely voters. We just had a new Pew poll drop, which had it at dead even at 49-49. What's your sense of the Times' poll and its accuracy and the state of the race more broadly? Do you think your averages are right?
I mean, I think so. I always trust an average over a single poll. The Times made the argument that their poll may be more reflective of reality because we just haven't had that many high-quality polls of late. To that, I would note that that's definitely possible. Their argument is that there may be slippage that Harris has observed since her honeymoon phase in mid-August, and that because we haven't really had too much high-quality polling, this could be the start of a slide for her as her numbers come back down to earth. To that, I would say I get that argument, but I haven't seen that slide track nationally just yet. The Times and Pew definitely have shown some worse numbers for her, but on the whole, right, like the Times would imply a significant swing right from 2020. The swing state polls we're seeing are mostly putting Harris in line with where Biden was in 2020. Michigan is about 1.5 to 2 points in favor of Harris. Pennsylvania is roughly a tie. Harris is up by 0.6 in our averages, which is just a half point right of where Biden was in 2020. Wisconsin is a little bit to the left. So to me, I have a hard time based off of just one poll assessing whether that's really the start of a shift against her or whether that's just induced by sampling error.
You're raising a critical point in saying that what the averages in the states show is something closer to 2020. So why would we think the national spread is not something like 2020? That's your argument, right?
More or less, yeah. That's essentially entirely it. It's possible you could just see a lot of slippage in California and New York, but really to conclude all of that based off of one poll is I'd like to see a little bit more evidence.
No, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. So Sarah Longwell, who does regular focus groups of undecided voters, had a piece making the case for optimism about Harris. And she's pretty hard-headed. She's not exactly a Democratic partisan, although she does want Trump to lose. Her case is there's still a chunk of those undecideds who haven't seen enough of Harris yet. This is what I think is holding her down at around 47%. which is, by the way, where she is nationally in all these states as well, in the averages. So, Lakshya, it seems to me that's consistent with a story of the election that goes like this. Harris made big strides toward reassembling the Democratic coalition, but isn't quite where she needs to be with young voters, Latinos, and blacks. Those voters, plus undecided whites, could plausibly be the ones who need to see more of her, but are absolutely gettable. Trump's a known quantity, and they're not with him. What do you think the data says? Is that argument more or less what you think is happening?
I would say so. I think more generally what we saw was that the boom of favorable coverage towards her for about a month, right? It was wall-to-wall positive coverage as she replaced Biden, went a long way towards bringing back almost all of those Democrats that had abandoned Biden. Right? Her margins with young voters are now back to basically normal in almost every poll and every cross-tab aggregations. She's made gains with black voters. She's made gains with Latinos. I think what's missing is that last sliver of voters who aren't necessarily as engaged haven't seen that much of Harris. They don't know much about her.
Yeah.
These are the types of voters that don't watch 3 to 4 hours of cable news every day. These are the types of voters that don't spend all the time on Twitter and Politico and the New York Times. And what we see over and over in polls is that voters don't want to vote for someone who they don't know much about. It's why advertising is so critical, because it gets your name out there. It's why messaging and rallies and whatnot, all of these things really help contribute to get your presence out there. Harris is not there yet because she just became a candidate. And in order to make some gains with those voters, she does need to get in front of them. Now, the good thing is that as more voters see her, the more they like her. Her favorables are skyrocketing up, but it needs to continue happening.
Right, and just to bear down on what you're saying there, both the New York Times poll and the new Pew poll show Harris at really not quite where she needs to be with Hispanics and maybe with blacks as well. Young voters, I think it's a little hard to say, but we've seen other polls getting her pretty close to where she needs to be. So that last sliver of voters, we're not just talking about white voters here, right? You're talking about there's a sliver of these young voters, a sliver of these Hispanics, a sliver of these blacks who had drifted away from Biden, alienated by Biden, aren't all the way back to Harris, but mainly because they're not paying attention. Like those are the ones that are just still poachable. Is that the argument?
Basically, because if you look at it, Biden, it's important to remember that Biden was mortally wounded as a candidate by the end.
Right.
He had lost so much ground that Harris had a big task to do in just getting all of those people back. She has made a lot of gains from those depths. Every poll shows her now better than what Biden was pulling at when he dropped out. So that's one thing. But that's different from saying she's where she needs to be, right? You can make 90% of the gains you need to, but until you make that final 10%, you're not there yet. That's basically the thing with Harris. She's gone from, trailing by 5 to leading by 2 nationally. But that's not enough, right? Like the last sliver of disengaged black voters, disengaged white voters, disengaged youth voters, skeptical moderates who are not necessarily super ideological. They don't see her much and they don't know what to make of her yet.
I think what you're saying is that those camps, those slim slivers of voters, are not in Trump's camp either, right? Because in Trump's best poll in a while, the New York Times one, he gets to 48% nationally. It seems to me that another key dynamic here is that there's just this durable majority resistance to Trump out there, that if she can just clear the acceptability bar as the alternative, then that prevents him from getting to a winning coalition and gets her kind of to it on her side. That now, as you say, this work is still there for her to be done, but the critical point is the work can be done, right? Yeah, the work can be done. And it's got to be said that, he's not an unknown quantity. He's run for president twice. Right.
His movement has had big losses in both midterms. People are familiar with Donald Trump and what he stands for. And, when you're dealing with that last sliver of undecided voters, of disengaged ones, etc., it's not clear to me that they really like Trump because, well, if you take a look at it, his unfavorables are very high. He's at -10 unfavorables. We're not expecting Trump to get 51% of the vote like Joe Biden did. So the question is, who's out there still that can be gotten if they're not with Trump right now after a lot of exposure to him. Can they come back to Harris's camp, or at the end, are they going to say, I still don't know enough. I'm either going to vote for Trump or I'm just not going to vote.
Right. And if I understand you correctly, this is kind of why you're skeptical of the idea that she's starting to revert to some sort of real previous status quo.
Yeah. Because firstly, what was the status quo for her? And secondly,
right.
What's the status quo now? Is it Biden's polling before he dropped out this cycle? Or is it 2016? Or is it 2020 when both Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden won the popular vote comfortably?
Yeah, well, there's always that point, too. Let's talk about what Jonathan Last wrote at the Bulwark. I'll summarize it. He made his own case for optimism. What he thinks is that the Times poll reflects Trump having a couple good cycles after Harris's entry into the race gave her a big bump that's now subsided. Jonathan Last argues that Harris just has to reassemble the coalition that beat Trump in 2020. I think that's what you're referring to when you talk about Biden's 2020 numbers, and that this can be done in the remaining time by winning those undecided groups we talked about. But essentially, the other piece of it is that Democratic enthusiasm is high, and that can also contribute to rebuilding that coalition. So you kind of come at it from two sides, right? One side is getting that last sliver. The other side is just padding those Democratic turnout numbers up. What do you think of that overall case? I mean, you're seeing these Dem enthusiasm numbers that we're all seeing. What's your take on it all?
Do I think Democrats are more fired up than before? Yes. But I don't think that the challenge for Harris lies in getting them to turn out to vote any longer. Okay. I don't think that's where it is. I think where it is that she needs to persuade now. I think Biden faced very real challenges with turnout. Voter registration patterns, self-reported likelihood to vote enthusiasm measures, all of that show Harris making significant gains. I'm skeptical that she needs to do much more in that regard. She's doing fine. I expect she'll continue to do fine. Where I do think that she needs to make some gains is that last sliver of voters that went towards defeating Donald Trump in 2020, especially at the fringes, they're not convinced by Harris yet. And she's got a little ways to go among a few groups. I'm skeptical of the argument that says that Kamala Harris has not moved to the middle at all. Most people cite the Tim Walz pick as a reason, but Walz is actually the most popular person on both tickets. I think personally that when it comes to reassembling that last bit of the anti-MAGA majority, if you want to call it, that defeated Trump in 2020, the coalition that more or less rejected that image for the country, what needs to happen is that Harris needs to really go out there a little bit more and tell people, this is what I stand for. This is how, we're going to carry forward the path for America. And this is where Donald Trump wants to take the country. Because a lot of voters in that Times Siena poll think that Trump represents a big change for Biden and that maybe that's necessary. But if you look at Project 2025 and their favorables for it, they all hate it.
The whole change debate is really kind of distorted and twisted because just simply because voters call Trump the agent of change doesn't mean that it's the change that they want.
Yeah.
I've never understood why people put so much weight on that number.
Well, I think it shows dissatisfaction with the current path of things. I think that's why it's important. But I think this is where, while another candidate may have a very real opening, I don't think that candidate is Donald Trump. I mean, don't get me wrong. He could absolutely win. It's a 50-50 shot in the model we're building right now. But yes, to be clear, it's less about that. And it's more about the fact that voters say they want change. So they're saying maybe we'd consider a big one. But then when you ask them about the specifics of Trump changes, they're like, no, not that. Like in every poll, we see this. Every time you repeat Trump's stance, they're like, I don't necessarily like that. The only one that they're kind of aligned with him on is immigration.
Yeah, and I think to get Harris to the place where she can capitalize on the desire for a new direction for the country, it's almost not necessarily about specific policies and just somehow conveying this kind of aura of independence from Biden. She's her own person. She wants to turn the page. I know that's a cliche a lot of people dislike, but it seems to me, okay, you strategically break with Biden on this policy, that policy, the other. But more important is to establish a bigger case that she's her own person. Don't you think? It's not just Harris saying, okay, I break with Biden on tax policy. It's much more kind of global than that, right? She's her own person.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Greg, I think this is also why I said she needs to get out there more, because if she's not,
Right.
voters are going to keep tying her to what they know about her, which is that she's Joe Biden's vice president.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't work when Joe Biden is at 40% approval nationally. In order for her to break that image and to be her own person, she's got to get all over there, talk to every single person. The thing that gets me is that Harris is very good at this now. She's not the same candidate she was in 2021. She's
amazing.
The more people see her, the more they like her. I've never seen a candidate's favorable skyrocket like this. And it just makes me wonder, why don't you want more of it? Why don't you want to get out there and put her on every show? Let her talk. Just let her be her. She knows this better than any of her consultants.
You know, it's really interesting that you say that, because in 2022, Harris kind of instinctually recognized from her conversations with voters and on the ground and so forth that abortion rights, reproductive rights were becoming a major defining issue. And I think there were a lot of consultants that were reluctant to get there. And she kind of trusted those instincts of hers and kind of went there and I think she was borne out in that. And so when she entered the race after Biden stepped aside, she also kind of trusted her own instinct and really seemed to get that it was about just sort of making people feel like they could get beyond MAGA, get beyond the Trump-Biden era, and just make people feel better. And that seemed to me to be a shrewd and astute political insight as well. So maybe you're right. Like, let her talk. Let her trust her own instincts, right?
A lot of us pollsters and data analysts miss the point that these numbers do not exist in a vacuum, right? To borrow the Kamala Harris phrase, they didn't just fall out of a coconut tree. They exist in the context of all that came before it. In Harris's case, what she's always been very good at, to me, when I see it, is she's been very good at recognizing the way that things are going to go. She's been very good at recognizing the mood of the voters, what results in positive coverage. I'll give you an example. When she said, "We're not going back" at the rally, I was very skeptical. I know Jeff Guerin was very skeptical because he made that argument to Kamala Harris's team saying, stop saying that, voters want something more forward-looking. Harris said, no, I hear the argument. I'm going to keep saying it because this is the type of energy that our base needs to feel. It hasn't hurt her in polling. There's no argument for it. It got a lot of positive press. It got a lot of donations. And importantly, what it did was it contrasted Donald Trump's vision for the country with hers in a very effective manner. And in that sense, it's just strange that, to me, you have a candidate who has channeled more Democratic enthusiasm than anyone since Barack Obama. And now she's perfectly poised to capitalize on possibly the biggest social rift of our lifetime in abortion and Roe v. Wade, and how Donald Trump's presidency may change that equation for a lot of women. Why not have her capitalize on that and have her message more thoroughly to the press?
Yeah, and she started that way when she first entered, and it was really strong stuff. She was very powerful when she spoke about that. Let's talk about the debate. Harris, so she has to continue consolidating support among young and non-white voters, shave down Trump's margins among non-college whites by winning some of the undecideds among them, probably here mostly with women, continue bringing in college-educated whites alienated by Trump, get separation from Biden in, I think, a big picture way. How does she get to this? What does she have to do to get all that done?
My personal thought is, during the debate, I know why Team Harris wanted unmuted mics. I don't think it's going to make that big of a difference, because voters are going to hear from her for the first time, really in a big setting that's not a campaign rally or a 60 minutes interview. They're going to see those two go directly head to head. The most important thing for her in that process is to articulate her own vision for the country very forcefully and very clearly, and counter that against Donald Trump's record directly. That's how she becomes her own person. Yeah. That's how she breaks out of that mold of being tied to Biden. And that's what gives a lot of these voters the idea of who she is and what she stands for. Because to me, this debate is not necessarily about persuasion. Debates rarely are. right? Unless it was a Biden versus Trump one, which had obvious counter effects for different reasons. We're not expecting Harris to flop at the debate in the way that Biden did. The bar is pretty low in that sense. So what she would do here is if she can just establish herself as her own person, hit Trump on his record, sure, but importantly, put her own vision out. That's the biggest thing that she needs to do to get people to recognize who she is and what she believes in. That's the thing that voters want to see.
Right, and it's very doable. I think in this reading of the race that you and I are doing here, the economy and immigration still gives the advantage to Trump, and we can't dismiss that. Those are big problems for Harris, I think. But she can kind of mute or soften concerns about them among just enough of these young, these non-white, these working class voters by saying the story Trump is telling about everything being a catastrophe is just not right at all. We've made real progress, and here's what I would do specifically, maybe differently from Biden. Trump has nothing real to offer except bluster. You've seen him for years. You really want him around another 4? Here's what I'll do. I'm my own person. I mean, is that a doable thing? Is that the task, and is it doable?
That's the task. Do I think it's doable? I think it's doable. I think it'll be hard because, importantly, you've only got a set period of time and there's a lot of things to cover, and these things always take conversational tracks that are different from what you might expect.
Right.
But I do think that not only is it doable, it's something that voters are almost, I don't want to say expecting, but voters would very likely be looking for.
They're craving it.
Yeah, they're looking for her to make that argument. They're looking for her to establish who she is. Even if you're not voting for Kamala Harris, even if you're skeptical, you still want to know more about who she is. And so voters will be giving her the benefit of the doubt of that framing that, okay, now I get to learn more about who this person is and what she stands for. And that gives her a sort of innate advantage here because everyone is going to be listening to you and you're going to get the attention you need. Can you play with it properly? Can you capitalize on it? That's a different question, but I think she can.
I do too. I think basically what you're saying is there's this kind of slice of voters who are just sort of floating around in a state of indecision and maybe a lack of knowledge of who she is, plenty of knowledge of who Trump is. They just want to hear her give them a way that they can vote against Trump.
Exactly. Well, not only that, but it's reminding voters. Yeah. It's reminding voters what they didn't like about Trump. And on this point, Greg, I do have to say that every time Donald Trump's policies get in the limelight, they never go well for him.
Very true. And that's why he's flipping around on a lot of different things. Now, we should stress, as you did earlier, Trump absolutely could win. Maybe the Times poll signals a larger reversion to a pre-Harris state of things. I don't know. But I do think we have the pieces here for a case of optimism about her chances, right? No certainty, of course, but, reasonable optimism. In a nutshell, what is that case?
While I could make a bull case for both Harris and Trump, and it is 50-50, as you said, the reason that I would be slightly more inclined to tilt to Harris is that without voters knowing that much about who she is, she's already tied in most swing state polling or slightly ahead against the most unpopular candidate that really anyone has run nationally in the last many years. The case for Harris just relies on her presenting herself more to voters, getting out there more, and reminding people what it is they dislike against a candidate who has significantly worse favorables than her. And to me, that gap, the public does not like Donald Trump. It is not clear to me that the public does not like Kamala Harris. I think that's the biggest difference.
Do you think that the negative advertising, the $500 million that's casting her as a crazy leftist who'll open the borders to criminals and let crime run rampant and criminals burn down cities, is that biting? It sounds like your case is that it's creating doubts, but that this is kind of surmountable, that she really is in command of how she is seen. That's what Absolutely. I think I'm hearing. And then that I think is the That I think is what underpins the case for cautious optimism, that she's
Absolutely.
in command if she wants to be.
Those ads are a problem for sure, but they're only a problem if you don't get out there and counter them every step of the way. And that's why I think the next 3 to 4 weeks are going to be so critical for Team Harris and just defining that, because finally Trump's attacks may have started to stick. If you look at the Times polling, we'll have to see for sure. But the way you can counter all of that is right now you've got the best time debate possible for you. You've got to take advantage of it.
How do you see this unfolding? Why are you cautiously optimistic? What's the way to point from point A to point B?
I think the reason I'm cautiously optimistic on Kamala Harris is that at this point, I've seen this film 3 or 4 times by now. Every time Donald Trump comes into the limelight, he does something or the other to remind the public of why he's the most unpopular presidential candidate in generations. And to me, the task that Trump has is a little bit harder than the task Harris has, because the task Trump has is to convince a bunch of people who don't like him that he's still better than the alternative. The task that Harris has is to convince a bunch of people who don't necessarily know that much about her and don't have firm opinions on her that she's better than the guy that they've seen for the last 8 years and the one who's cost Republicans in every election since 2016.
Really well said. Lakshya Jain, thank you so much for this discussion. It was really interesting.
Thanks, Greg.
Everybody, make sure to check out some new stuff we have up at TNR.com. Alex Shepard asking whether Kamala Harris is imitating Biden's failed media strategy, and Michael Tomasky arguing that Trump at bottom has only one debate strategy, which is to try to get America to hate Harris. And make sure to keep up with the Deep State Radio Network's other podcasts, including the newest episode of Above Average Intelligence, which features the former director of the NCSC to talk about today's evolving counterintelligence landscape. We'll see you all tomorrow. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler and the DSR Network.